Hi there, I'm Lauren Sonnenberg with LifeCore, and welcome to this week's edition of Mind Body Talk on chronic pain. And today the discussion is focused on the questions to ask when you're exploring mind-body connections in chronic pain. So this discussion is geared especially to people with chronic pain who feel at a loss as to how to get pain relief, where to even start that process. Um, Maybe they're just not understanding why their pain is persisting. So hopefully this will open some doors for people. Might be the first time a person's looked at addressing their pain from a mind-body perspective. Hi, Kathy. Thanks for joining us here today. And it might also be helpful for any medical or mental health professionals who may be wanting to get into exploring the more mind-body connections with their patients and clients. I mean, we see so many professionals in the medical and mental health world looking more into the integrative approaches, and certainly nowadays it's not a surprise to anybody to say, well, stress impacts the body. We're just talking about going a little bit more specific with the stresses, and it's not just stress, but in general, we're looking at how conflicts play out within the body, stressors and conflicts. So hopefully this will be helpful to a lot of people. And with these questions we're talking about today, there's some basic questions to get the gears spinning. Of course, we can't cover all possible scenarios, of course, but the goal is to cover some basic questions that fall under three main categories. And there's a little overlap, but in general, we're looking at activating, prolonging, and complicating factors. So even before we start with those specific questions, it's going to lay the groundwork a little bit. So when you start doing mind-body work with people, I'm sure people know how to do active listening when they're in, certain professions, but we are tuning into listening for specific words that we might not have interpreted the same way in the past as we do as we start to look for mind-body connections. So let's give an example of some verbal cues that a person might say. And this is a blatant one. I mean, when a person says, this person is a pain in my neck, this person's a pain in my butt, lots of things that people say, like they're literally saying this person or this thing that I'm dealing with, this project is a pain for me. So when people are saying that, we might listen very clearly for that mind-body relationship, because that one's a giveaway. And of course here we're just talking about mind-body philosophy, haven't gotten into the deeper science as to what that all may mean. But when somebody says they feel unsupported, I'm not surprised if they have back pain. That's a common connection we see there. Some other mind-body cues that a person may have, like, I just can't digest this thing. Not surprisingly, we're probably going to be looking at digestive issues there. I'm so irritated by this person or this situation. And if it's something ongoing, we wouldn't be surprised that a person had irritable bowel syndrome. Now, these are potentially overgeneralizations, because I haven't gotten into the science, say, of German new medicine yet here for you today, and we're not going to get heavy into that, but I'm going to talk about pieces of that. That's a mind-body science that shows biological or bio-emotional conflicts that result in biological programs that play out in a conflict active phase and a healing phase. So you're going to hear me talk about that today, and I talk about that in a lot of the mind-body talks that I do. So okay, we lay the groundwork there, put it out there, say, okay, just listen with a a different ear than you may have historically, or listen to the words you're saying yourself if it's you and your own chronic pain. Say, oh, that's interesting. So the first question, and this is the key, this is going to look at some activating factors, like what was happening in your life prior to the onset of this pain? And it may have happened immediately before or up into even 6 months before. And here's the clarifier in that question. It could be something that was getting worse in your life, like a notable event, a big event that happened, something negative, or something that got better. And it might be a progressively getting better thing. And the reason we ask that is sometimes we see pain show up in the conflict active phase when the conflict just starts, and that's where the pain initiates. And sometimes, and this happens very predictably according to German New Medicine, we'll see the pain come up in the healing phase. So you will have no pain at all during the conflict active phase. The pain comes on in the conflict resolution or healing phase. So that's why it's really important to see, and it's a lot easier to see at first when pain initiates right after a negative event happened. Oh, well, there we go. There's an instant connection. And we do see that because sometimes a person goes into healing very quickly. If it's a sharp event, but it's not a long-lasting, something that a person's just really bothered by, and then you'll see the resolution of it oftentimes right away. Especially if the source of the conflict or the trigger is no longer occurring, like a once and done thing. But many times conflicts just don't resolve that easily. So that's one reason we'll see prolongation of symptoms for people. So going further here, the next thing isn't a question, but it leads into a question. So describe your pain for me. That's just a common statement a person would make. Please describe your pain for me. Or you might be describing it for yourself. You do a little exercise where you write down, let me just put it into words. When I actually describe this pain, how am I describing it? Let's say a person says, it's this really annoying pain in my neck. So, a question you can ask then is, just to go out on a limb, is there anybody or anything in your life that's currently annoying you? Well, then the person might say, well, now that you asked, about a couple months ago, my family member moved in, and we have these constant, battles, and I've heard this hundreds of times, literally, that type of scenario. So it may be these little instances where things come up, little but meaningful. I mean, maybe not earth-shattering per se, but they come up and then they're resolved. So you have something that's happening, a conflict. Let's say it's a self-devaluation conflict, and then you don't see where a person actually feel put down or not okay about themselves in some way. You don't see the pain while that conflict is active. You see it in the conflict resolution phase. So they start to go into resolution. That's when the pain shows up in that instance, in that type of scenario. That's different than a nerve pain type pain. So, so here we are segueing into prolonging factors. Well, what if a person, this is ongoing, so the person, they start to resolve it, and then boom, a conflict comes up again. And so two things can happen then. If they were fully resolved, well, they still had the pain. They didn't actually complete the healing process. If they didn't actually complete the healing process, basically this new conflict will probably just slow down and suppress that healing, probably wouldn't take away all of the symptoms. But if they had fully healed it and the pain had gone away, and then boom, the pain comes up. So this is persistent pain. A chronic pain is obviously up, down, and keeps lasting. So depending upon when the conflict is reactivated will show us what type of symptoms we have. But here's a question. Do you think there's a way to resolve this situation, this conflict, this problem on a practical or emotional level? The person will say, well, you know what, actually, we can resolve this practically or personally. There's no way to resolve this practically, but maybe I can start to work on it on an emotional level. Maybe I can work with a therapist, a counselor, maybe maybe they're a pastor, maybe they're EFT coach. Somebody to help you work on the emotional or psycho-spiritual components of that conflict, because there could be a lot derived from that is very freeing and healing. So so that's a good sign. So that's a one way to start actually working on overcoming that, because if you have to live with something ongoing, you don't want to be stuck in this cycle of symptoms and a conflict, active conflict resolution, conflict, active conflict resolution, because obviously nobody wants chronic pain or chronic any negative symptom in their body. And so here's another question. When a person knows, when we're talking about the type of conflict or the type of pain that comes up in the healing phase versus a pain that shows up in the conflict active phase, and you're reading about this and you're understanding this on a scientific level, or it's presented to you by your healthcare professional, that the pain you're experiencing is actually a healing symptom. The question to ask then is, how do you feel about that? And if you're like, no way that could be, well, that mentality, it's fine to have it. I mean, there's no judgment on that at all. It's a natural response for being presented with a new paradigm to look at. I'm seeing this in a totally different light. Whoa, I don't know if I can do that. Or sometimes a person says, well, I feel really good about that. It's kind of a new thought. I'm going to have to kind of practice thinking that when my pain shows up, because it's just not something I feel like it can change overnight. My understanding of it totally makes sense. And that's why oftentimes this healing of chronic pain, the resolution of its chronicity, this persistence that shows up, is a bit of a process. It's like a person gets to here and they plateau, and then they maybe, it takes them a little while and they get to here and they plateau, but before you know it, and their symptoms are improving and their empowerment around their experience of the pain and their symptoms is improving, and they aren't weighted down like they used to be when something flares up, or they're understanding, oh yes, now I see exactly, because we talked about the science, and there I see it playing out like day and night, like exactly as we thought it would be, following the cycle. And that is super liberating for a person to see it play out and finally understand why it's happening the way it is. Okay, so just that question, how do you feel about it? Let's see, another question we can look at. Are there other notable stressors in your life right now? And these may identify conflicts that have nothing to do with pain symptoms. But we know that if we take into account this German new medicine, that when we're conflict active, when we're weighed down by an activated stressor, a specific bioemotional conflict, and we're already in the healing phase of another conflict, it's already gone into healing, now that higher level stress is going to make the body more sympathicatonic, so it doesn't allow the vagatonia, that relaxed, tired, weak, oftentimes hungry, but not always, depending upon what you have going on in your body, phase, which is a reparative phase. It kind of holds that back and slows it down a little bit for a person when you have other conflicts that are active that aren't necessarily related to the pain. So we would want to obviously help a person get a handle on that too, because we want to provide an optimal environment for a person to be able to heal. And so sometimes, even if you haven't gotten a handle on that stressor, those other stressors, just knowing that that could be playing a factor and say, oh, well, I understand why this may be taking a little longer to heal because I have all these other stressors going on. And chemically, like my body is going to load it up with all these, the stress, this cortisol in my body. And so it may take a little longer to heal than I would have thought. Okay. And just, when I say notable stressors, they don't have to be earth-shatteringly monumental, but they could be things like, my spouse lost their job, or which could be monumental for many people. Don't mean to minimize it either. Let's see, it could be something like just found out that my kid is failing this class, and I just found out that there's this, this strife in the, parent-teacher, whatever conflicts that happen in people's lives. So it may be a back burner stress, it may be a low-grade stress, but it's getting in the way of your healing. Could be. So it's a worthwhile question to ask, especially if it's been an ongoing stressor. Now, we talk about then the third area would be complicating factors. Okay. A question to ask that may illuminate some factors here. And these are questions you certainly may already be asking. When does your pain show up? When is your pain the worst? When does it flare up? So if you happen to see, or maybe get to go back and see I did a two-part on chronic migraines, and the second one was called Stopping Chronic Migraines in Their Tracks. And maybe a cutesy title, but it was actually using the term tracks that is used in German New Medicine. And so we might look at something like a track that a person gets on that's every weekend they get a migraine, for example. So, well, that's a good sign to say, well, what's actually going on during the week? And, 9 times out of 10, it's something work-related if it's happening during the week, and then on the weekend, like clockwork, they're getting a migraine. So we have to really look at, all right, so the next question would be, so what's going on at work? What may be stressing you there? Do you have any, what are you dealing with there? Some open-ended questions to get a person to think about it. And a lot of times people will have really big aha moments. Sometimes not as light bulbish, but sometimes it's a slower unfolding. And there's no right or wrong way for this to unfold. And I've mentioned this other piece in some of my mind body talks, and this is a more delicate topic, and this is the last one I'm going to talk about today, unless people have specific questions at the end. I'll address those, and it's a harder one because it really gets into the subconscious, and it's also challenging because when a person hears this question at first, they may think, are you blaming me for my pain? And I did a whole presentation or discussion on that one too. So of course, just because we say, we identify mind-body connections is absolutely not like blaming a person for their pain, because you know what, life happens, conflicts happen, conflict resolution happens, and we have symptoms resulting from all of that. And biological programs, aka diseases, but they're actually functional responses of the body in order to make the body stronger. That's why, according to German New Medicine, why we have the actual responses that our body has, pain and other symptoms. But not to lead you astray to say sometimes the pain does happen in the conflict active phase. This certainly when the periosteum is involved, when we have an intense separation conflict, that's when you'll first see it with that. So not to be confusing if this is the first time you're seeing or hearing all this. So the question then, we're looking at, are there any reasons, or are there any benefits that you have for holding on to this pain? It's a hard question to answer, but and it's not a first conversation kind of question. It's generally not a first. It's after you've established some of this mind-body understanding, because people, sometimes this is the last piece this is the last stone to be turned over, to say, oh, I've resolved all this other stuff. But what are the benefits? And sometimes people have worked through these already, but it's worth looking at to be thorough, because you might have looked at everything else, but is there any benefit? Like, am I getting more care from people that I wasn't getting care from before? I'm actually finally able to take some me time for myself when I was stressed for 58 years, I'm just throwing out numbers here, and I finally got a little bit of time to just not be in doing mode all the time. So it's a hard question to really look inwards at, but it may be playing a complicating role in a person's pain. Maybe not, but to be thorough, we really do need to look at that question at least some point during the exploration of chronic pain. So I'm just going to take a moment here to look at if there are any questions that a person has. By all means, feel free to ask them, and really glad to have you here today. I see Kathy and Michelle, so thank you both for joining. And since I don't see any questions right now, I will look forward to seeing everybody next week, next Thursday, 2 p.m. Eastern. Thanks again for watching, and see you next week. Bye-bye.